This session is entitled The Relevance of Republicanism After 90 Years of the Irish State. And to chair it, we have Tommy McKearney, who's an organiser with the Independent Workers' Union, among other things. He's also a journalist, and of course he's associated with Fourthwrite.
Mary Murphy, and on my right, Micheál MacAonghusa, and we'll be introducing them further later. Irish republicanism after 90 years. There's an old observation has been made in terms of global politics made about Russia, and it's said that quite often Russia is never as strong as her advocates and admirers believe it to be, yet at the same time Russia is never as weak as her enemies believe that she is or would wish her to be. Sometimes I think the same could be applied perhaps to socialism, in spite of the triumphalism that we might be hearing over the last few years from Wall Street and Frankfurt and the City of London. And perhaps just along the same lines, republicanism in Ireland, maybe, just maybe, the same could be said about it. I would guess that through the years of Daniel O'Connell, there were those that would have said that the radical republicanism of the United Irishmen was certainly something of the past. Perhaps through the years of Parnell and Redmond, it was said that the Fenian spirit was with O'Leary and the Greaves. And even in 1966, republicanism on this island was deemed sufficiently domesticated, tamed and emasculated that Fianna Fáil was able to celebrate it along with RTE, itself a sort of tribute to how safe the thought Irish republicanism could be. And in spite of all that, we're still talking about Irish republicanism tonight. Irish republicanism, of course, can be multifaceted, and while it certainly does advocate individual freedom, republicanism as well, there's a school, and a very strong school, that argues for the common good, something that's imperative, I would argue. And as well as that, the spirit of republicanism that has forever in this island advocated the sovereignty of the people and their right to determine how they would live. And in this modern era, when it's possible to say that the impact of London isn't quite what it used to be, we're now looking at a time when the impact of Brussels, Berlin, the Troika is quite arguably as much an imperial power as anything that we've experienced in the past, although in albeit in different formats. So I think it's a particularly opportune moment to debate the relevance of republicanism after 90 years of the Irish state, and I think we're particularly grateful to the Desmond Greaves School and its organisers for having provided this opportunity, and I would personally like to thank them, and I'm sure we all would endorse that here tonight. And our first speaker to discuss this topic is Micheál MacAonghusa. Micheál MacAonghusa, a historian, a journalist, lifelong campaigner for social justice, and among his many campaigns, he has argued and campaigned against the domination of the European Union, and he has also campaigned on behalf of the Palestinian people, the oppressed Palestinian people. So, without more ado, Micheál, perhaps you would take the podium, please.
Because you have summarised what needs to be said so well that I wonder, is it necessary to go into some of the details? But in fact, it might be no harm to do what John Major, you remember John Major? What John Major told us we should do, go back to basics. Because sometimes when we don't go back to basics, we start using labels. And in using the labels, we apply the labels to something which is completely irrelevant to what was involved under those titles in the first place. The United Irishmen fought for the rights of man in Ireland, which encompassed the breaking of the connection with England, the undoing of sectarianism by replacing religious denominational identities with the concept of citizenship, and universal male franchise. Like the mainstream of European and indeed French revolutionaries, they never actually got around to considering the franchise for women, but they were well ahead of practically all others of their time. They conceived of a nation which would embrace all the people, regardless of their various ethnic origins. The insurgents of 1916 came a century and a quarter later, and coming a century and a quarter later, they showed the development of political thought that had taken place in the meantime. They set out their objects clearly as the ownership of Ireland, independence and unfettered sovereignty, religious and civil liberties, equal rights and opportunities for all its citizens, the pursuit of the happiness and prosperity of the nation, and the overcoming of sectarianism. The differences carefully fostered by an alien government, as they described it. And of course, it was clear from the very opening of the 1916 proclamation that all rights, privileges and duties would be common to both women and men. Less than 3 years later, the revolutionary Dáil Éireann, in its democratic programme, reiterated the absolute right of the people to the ownership of Ireland. It declared, quoting Pearse, that the sovereignty of the nation extended not only to all men and women of the nation, but also to its material possessions, and reaffirmed that all right to private property must be subordinated to the public right and welfare. It went on to affirm the right of every man and woman to the opportunity to serve the nation and to an adequate share of the produce of the nation's labour. It set out the duty of the Irish government to secure that no child shall suffer hunger or cold from the lack of food, clothing or shelter. It laid down that the aged and infirm should not be regarded as a burden, but rather entitled to the nation's gratitude and consideration. It went on to emphasise the necessity to safeguard the health of the people in any government programme. And the democratic programme continues to lay down, it shall be our duty to promote the development of the nation's resources, to increase the productivity of its soil, to exploit its mineral deposits, peat bogs and fisheries, the waterways and harbours, in the interests of and for the benefit of the Irish people. And it also had an international dimension in that it set out that the government of the Republic would seek the cooperation of other governments to achieve a universal standard of social and industrial legislation to improve the conditions of the working class. Modern Irish republicanism has always looked to the furtherance of the national rights of the Irish people to self-government, control of the economic resources of the country, and the removal of all imperial hegemony. There are many who think that talk of national rights is passé or irrelevant in the 21st century. There are even those on the left, parties who at best studiously ignore anything which might suggest a national question, or at worst, who take a position which objectively places them on the side of imperialism. They're nothing new to Irish life. Connolly argued with them over many years a century ago. And in the 1930s, Antrim Sean Murray, freedom fighter, IRA commandant and a prime founder of the Communist Party of Ireland, warned, "You may ignore the national question, but the national question won't ignore you." Parties who try to ignore it have no long-term future and will eventually hit a stone wall. While we are talking a lot about the national question, we should really be talking about the imperial question. We also hear a lot still about the Irish problem or the Northern Irish problem. Let's put this terminology on its head and talk about the imperial problem in Ireland. There are people who say British imperialism is dead. Far from it. The city, as they call it, the London financial core, is a leading centre in world imperialism. It is one of the world centres where conditions are laid down for the political, diplomatic and military activity of major states. Wars, open and covert, are fought in its interest, and sometimes individuals are assassinated because they are considered dangerous to its interests, or indeed because they know too much. Having a very dirty mind, I can't help thinking about this unfortunate family which was massacred in France. Yeah. It was clearly an act of state terrorism and nothing else. Which state, I don't know, but if I was opening a book on it, I would put a couple of them up at the top for it. And it happens much more often, actually, than we think sometimes. Yes, indeed. The nature of British, or more accurately English imperialism, has changed greatly since the days of Kitchener and Lloyd George. The colonial pattern of taking over territories and running them for the benefit of the metropolis, particularly for its ruling class, has been substituted by taking control of resources and markets while creating a subservient local clique to carry out the donkey work of administration and suppression of anti-imperialist resistance. And this is all done, this time, under the native flag. Ireland was something of a guinea pig in that process. When faced with resistance throughout its empire in the middle of the 20th century, London granted, mark you, formal independence without threatening the economic or social system. This accommodated flag nationalism and satisfied many who were happy to see the Union Jack coming down without any real sovereignty of the people. The name on the shop changed, but the franchise owner was the same. Another change in British imperialism is that it has been subsumed to a greater or lesser extent in the American imperialist sphere. This has been going on for about 70 years and has been accentuated by the events of 1989 to 91, when the US became the sole superpower. Washington and London followed the same general strategy under US leadership, with the latter trying to hold its own and hold on to its share of the plunder. Occasionally, there may be minor differences about tactics, but generally, particularly since the consolidation soldered by Tony Blair, the English ruling class has accepted its place as a junior partner. Part of this process is a cultural Americanization with worldwide effect, but with a very deep effect in the countries within the London orbit. There are a number of national questions on the island of Britain, and one of them is the Americanization of England. Ireland, I suggest, is far more Americanized than England is, and certainly more Anglo-Americanized than it was Anglicized a century ago. It